Caleb Ward drove a white stake into the mud beside the stock pond, then poured pale bentonite into 4 square patches along a bank everyone else had already decided was just bad ground. From the pasture fence, his Uncle Wes laughed. "You making a pond or frosting a cake?" Caleb kept working. The water had dropped enough that last week's wet mark showed clearly on the stake. Another shallow notch, cut that morning, sat lower still. Every few days, more shoreline appeared. Grass near the bank was turning dusty before summer had even settled in. Roy Ward stood uphill with his arms folded. The pond was his. So was the pasture, the equipment, and the decision about what happened next. Caleb could measure anything he wanted. He could make suggestions. But after months of asking for more responsibility, Roy had still refused to put him in charge of pasture management. Not while the farm's main stock pond was losing water faster than anyone could explain. Caleb pushed the bentonite bag upright. "I'm not asking to seal the whole pond." "You've said that 3 times, Roy replied. "I'm asking for one supervised test." Wes nodded toward the white squares. "That's the test." "Part of it." That earned another laugh. To Wes, the pale clay looked like expensive mud being dumped onto ordinary mud. To Caleb, the squares were supposed to answer a question nobody else had separated from the larger problem. Was the entire pond bottom leaking? Or was most of the loss coming from one section? For nearly 2 weeks, Caleb had walked the shoreline at the same time each morning. He marked the water level, watched damp edges retreat, and compared the exposed bank after calm nights and windy afternoons. The decline was not perfectly even. The change near the east bank kept bothering him. That side seemed to expose fresh ground first. Roy had noticed Caleb's stakes. He had also noticed a notebook Caleb carried everywhere. What he had not done was hand over the pasture. Instead, that morning, he made the limit clear. 1 test area. 1 small amount of approved material. No unsupervised machinery. No livestock moved on Caleb's judgment. If Caleb wanted more authority, he first had to produce something Roy could see. Caleb accepted. That mattered more than he let Wes know. He had already spent part of his own save money on approved bentonite and simple soil testing supplies. If the experiment failed, he would not just lose material. He would confirm exactly what Roy feared, that Caleb liked ideas more than consequences. Caleb carried the first bucket toward the exposed edge. His plan looked simple. Spread dry bentonite over the suspected seep area. Let the fine clay settle into openings. Track the marked waterline. If the decline slowed near the test section, he would have evidence worth taking back to Roy. He scattered the powder carefully across the damp surface. For a few minutes, it looked promising. The white layers settled into cracks and low spots. Against the dark pond soil, the test squares were impossible to miss. Wes leaned against the fence. "So when do we celebrate?" Caleb ignored him. Then a light runoff began moving down the bank from a wet patch higher on the slope. The first thin ribbon of water reached the edge of Caleb's nearest square. The white powder shifted. Caleb crouched. A pale streak slid downhill. Then another. Within minutes, part of the clean square had blurred into a fan-shaped smear. Wes gave a low whistle. "There goes your magic mud." Caleb did not answer. He grabbed a notebook and looked from the washed clay to the waterline stake. His first instinct was to add more bentonite. He stopped himself. More powder spread the same way would only mean more material lost the same way. Roy came down the bank. "You done?" Caleb stared at the streaks. "No. The clay is moving." "I know. That was the idea you asked me to prove." Caleb nodded. He could feel Wes waiting for him to defend it. Instead, Caleb walked the damaged square and pushed his fingers into the soil beneath it. The texture was fine and sticky near the surface. 20 feet farther along the bank, the exposed bottom felt different. grainier, looser. Caleb looked back toward the 4 test squares. He had treated them as though the pond bottom were one material, but the bank beneath his boots was already telling him otherwise. He stood and looked at Roy. "I tested the bentonite before I tested the soil." Roy's expression did not soften, but he did not tell Caleb to pack up. Caleb picked up 2 empty jars. Before he could prove how to stop the pond from falling, he had to answer a more dangerous question. What if the leak was not one problem at all? Caleb filled the first jar from the dark, sticky soil beneath his failed test square. The second came from farther down the east bank, where the exposed bottom felt gritty between his fingers. The third came from a shallow depression closer to the center line of the pond. By noon, 3 jars sat on the workbench in Roy's equipment shed, each holding pond soil and water. Wes glanced at them as he passed. "You growing something in those now?" Caleb shook one jar hard and set it beside the others. "No, looks like mud." "That's the point." Wes laughed and kept walking. Caleb watched the suspended soil begin settling. The differences did not appear immediately. That bothered him. He had hoped for something obvious enough to carry straight back to Roy. 3 clean layers, 1 clear answer, no argument. Instead, the jars looked almost identical at first. Brown water, fine particles drifting, dark sediment gathering at the bottom. Caleb forced himself to wait. The pond had been losing water for weeks. An extra hour would not change that. By late afternoon, the jars told a different story. The sample from beneath the original test patch had settled heavily, with much of the fine material packed near the bottom. The sample from farther along the east bank showed a noticeably different mix. More coarse particles, less fine material binding them together. Caleb carried the jars outside. Roy was checking a gate before moving cattle to another paddock. "Look at these." Roy glanced at the jars. "What am I looking at?" "Different bottom material." Roy wiped his hands on his jeans and took one. Caleb pointed. "This came from under the first patch. This one came from farther east." Roy held both toward the light. "And the second one's looser, more sand in it." "You know that from jars?" "I know they don't settle the same." Roy handed one back. "That doesn't tell me which part is leaking." "No." Caleb appreciated that Roy said it before he could. The jars were evidence of variation, not evidence of seepage. Caleb still needed to connect the two. The next morning, he returned to the pond before the sun had climbed high enough to throw glare across the water. He checked the stake. The level had fallen again. He recorded the mark. Then he walked the east bank with small flags, comparing exposed soil dampness, slope, and the places where the shoreline seemed to retreat fastest. He did not pretend he could see water disappearing into the ground. What he could see was pattern. The original fine soil patch was not behaving like the grainier section farther along. That difference gave him a better experiment. Instead of scattering more bentonite across the surface, Caleb wanted to test a small prepared section where the sealing material would be blended into the existing soil and compacted. Roy listened from the tailgate of his truck. "You already used some of what I approved." "I know." "How much more?" "Enough for one small patch." "And if that fails?" "Then I stop before we waste a rest." That answer mattered. Roy looked toward the pond. Caleb had spent most of the previous year trying to prove he was ready by asking for bigger responsibility. More pasture decisions. More equipment time. More say over livestock rotations. Roy had heard ambition. What Caleb offered now was a limit. One patch. One answer. Then stop or continue based on what happened. Roy nodded once. "You can prepare it. Any equipment work. I'm there." "Agreed." They chose a small test section where the soil conditions matched the finer jar sample closely enough to make comparison useful. Caleb marked the boundaries and measured the approved material rather than guessing. With Roy controlling the equipment work, they incorporated the bentonite into the prepared soil instead of leaving it loose on top. The difference was immediate. Nothing dramatic happened. No leak visibly closed. No water rose. But the pale powder disappeared into the darker soil rather than sitting exposed where runoff could carry it away. Caleb worked the edges by hand when machinery could not safely reach. Roy handled the compaction. When they finished, the patch looked less impressive than Caleb's original white squares. That amused Wes when he arrived. So, the big improvement is we can't see it anymore. Caleb drove a small marker beside the prepared section. The improvement is it stays where we put it. Wes looked at Roy. Roy said nothing. That silence helped Caleb more than agreement would have. The first test had failed in public. This one would have to succeed the same way. Caleb set up the comparison carefully. The prepared patch. A nearby untreated section. The main waterline stake. He recorded the starting condition and date. Then he stopped touching it. That became the hardest part. Every morning, he wanted to inspect too aggressively. Dig an edge. Probe the soil. Add material where something looked questionable. Roy stopped him once. You testing it or changing it? Caleb pulled his hand back. Testing it. Then let it test. Caleb nodded. By the third morning, the pond itself had continued falling. That was discouraging until Caleb looked more closely at the two marked sections. The untreated area remained visibly wetter along a receding edge. The prepared patch appeared more stable. Not proven, but different. Caleb wrote it down without calling it success. On the fourth day, Alice Monroe stopped by to speak with Roy about summer grazing. She kept cattle on neighboring ground and sometimes leased extra pasture when forage tightened. Caleb heard enough of the conversation to understand the problem. Alice needed dependable summer grass. Roy had grass. But pasture without dependable stock water was not dependable pasture. Alice looked toward the pond. That the one still dropping? Roy nodded. We're testing it. She glanced at Caleb's stakes and markers. Roy looked at Caleb. He is. Alice studied the prepared patch. When will you know? Caleb answered carefully. Not yet. Wes smiled. Best answer he's given all week. Caleb ignored him. The resource limit had not changed. They still had only so much bentonite. Only limited equipment time. And now a possible grazing opportunity was waiting on an answer Caleb did not yet have. The patch had survived longer than the loose surface treatment. But surviving a few days was not proof. By the fifth morning, Caleb knew the first experiment had failed more completely than he wanted to admit. He walked back to the original white test square before checking anything else. Almost none of the clean outline remained. The bentonite he had scattered across the surface had streaked downhill, collected in shallow depressions, and thinned across the places he had actually meant to treat. He crouched and ran 2 fingers through the residue. The mistake was visible enough that Wes did not need to say anything. Caleb had spent money on approved material. He had asked Roy for permission. He had made the test noticeable enough for everyone to watch. And the first thing everyone had seen was pale clay washing away from the exact ground Caleb had claimed needed treatment. Roy came down the bank carrying the notebook Caleb had left on the truck seat. You forgot this. Caleb took it. Thanks. Roy looked at the ruined square. You gonna record that too? Caleb knew what he meant. Not just the water line, the wasted material, the failed method. The part Caleb would rather leave out when explaining why he needed more bentonite. He opened the notebook. Surface application moved before it could stay mixed with the soil. Roy waited. Caleb added another line. Material loss significant enough not to repeat. Roy nodded. No lecture. No argument. Caleb almost preferred Wes's jokes. Roy's silence forced him to own the failure himself. He walked to the compacted test patch. The main waterline stake still showed loss across the pond as a whole, but the prepared section had not broken apart. Its edges were intact. The soil remained dense underfoot where Roy had compacted it. Caleb checked the nearby untreated comparison. That edge had continued changing. The contrast was small enough that he measured twice before writing anything. Then he stopped himself from measuring a third time. He was looking for certainty before enough time had passed to earn it. That was the same impatience that had put loose powder on the surface in the first place. A simple idea. A fast result. A reason to say he had solved something. Caleb shut the notebook. For the next 2 days, he changed nothing. He checked the stake at the same hour, observed the marked sections, wrote down what he saw. Nothing more. On the 6th day, Wes came with him. You stare at that stake long enough, maybe it'll get embarrassed and stop dropping. Caleb looked at the new mark. The pond was still losing water, but the prepared section remained stable compared with a nearby untreated edge. He pointed to the 2 areas. Look at the boundary. Wes squinted. This side is pulled back farther. Could be the slope. Could be. The sun. Could be. Wind. Could be. Wes looked at him. You agreeing with me now? I'm saying one difference doesn't prove the reason. That answer took some of the amusement out of Wes's face. That's why I'm waiting 7 days. On the 7th morning, Roy came down with them. Caleb checked the main stake first. The pond had dropped again. He felt disappointment before reminding himself that he had never been testing the whole pond. Not yet. He walked to the compacted patch. The treated section still held its shape. The nearby comparison showed a clearer retreat. Roy stepped across the markers. Same starting point. Caleb opened the notebook and showed him the dated sketch. Same day, same reference. Roy read the entries and looked toward the washed-out remains of Caleb's first attempt. So the loose stuff failed. Yes. And this didn't. This patch held better for 7 days. Wes folded his arms. That mean you fix a pond? Caleb shook his head immediately. No. Roy looked at him. What does it mean? Caleb pointed toward the soil jars. It means the method works better when the bentonite matches the soil and gets mixed and compacted instead of scattered on top. Roy looked across the pond. 1 patch. 1 patch. A week earlier, Caleb would have hated that limitation. Now it felt important. He had not proved the pond could be repaired. He had proved one small section could behave differently when treated differently. That afternoon, Alice returned. How'd the test go? Roy answered before Caleb could. The compacted patch held. Alice looked at Caleb. For how long? 7 days so far. She nodded toward the pasture. If Roy can make the water dependable, I could use some summer grazing. For the first time, the pond was no longer just a maintenance problem. It had become tied to income. Caleb should have felt vindicated. Instead, he looked across the basin at the soil zones he had only started to understand. The successful patch had answered one question. It had also created a much more expensive one. Could he scale a treatment that worked in one kind of bottom soil without assuming the rest of the pond was the same? Roy did not approve the basin repair that afternoon. He made Caleb wait until the next morning. By sunrise, Caleb had drawn a rough basin map. The compacted test patch sat on one side. The failed surface square sat on another. Between them, Caleb had marked places where the exposed bottom appeared finer, heavier, or more granular. Roy studied the page at the kitchen table. You think all of this needs treatment? I think the leaking areas do. That isn't what I asked. Caleb paused. No, I don't know that all of it does. Roy tapped the map. How much bentonite would you use? Caleb had estimated it 3 different ways. Each estimate depended on assumptions he could not fully prove. They did not have unlimited material. They also did not have endless equipment time to return to the drain edges and rework sections one by one. Caleb gave Roy the safest answer he could. Enough to treat the areas we identify as likely seep zones, not the whole pond blindly. Roy leaned back. That sounds different from what you were saying a week ago. It is. Wes stood at the counter pouring coffee. What happened to the magic mud? It washed away. Wes smiled. Caleb continued. The compacted patch didn't. Roy looked back at the map. Alice called last night. Caleb straightened. She's still interested? In a limited summer lease, yes. If I can show her dependable water. The words mattered. Not more grass. Not a bigger herd. Dependable water. Roy continued. I'll approve one basin repair window. I run the equipment or choose who does. You control the mapping and where the approved material goes. For months, Caleb had asked Roy to trust him with pasture decisions. Roy still was not doing that. But this was the first time Caleb's work would control where farm resources were committed beyond a tiny test square. Wes glanced at the map. So now we're betting a lease on jars of dirt? Roy answered without looking at him. We're betting one repair day on a test that held. That ended the joke. Caleb looked down at the basin map again. The 7-day patch had changed something. Roy was now making a farm decision based partly on Caleb's evidence. That should have made Caleb more cautious. Instead, success made the problem look simpler. The compacted patch had worked. The basic method seemed clear. Blend the bentonite into the existing soil. Compact it. Use enough material to close the seep paths. Caleb began calculating how much ground they could cover during the single equipment window. The more zones he separated, the slower the work became. Different rates meant stopping, rechecking, adjusting, possibly leaving part of the basin untreated before equipment time ran out. A uniform treatment would be faster, easier to stage, easier for Roy to apply consistently. And based on a successful patch, Caleb had a rate he already knew could work somewhere. Alice returned 2 days later to walk the pasture with Roy. The waterline stake stood exposed near the bank, each old mark showing how steadily the pond had been retreating. Alice looked at it. If this keeps falling like that, I can't put cattle here. I know, Roy said. When would you need an answer? Caleb asked. Before I commit them somewhere else. That tightened the timeline immediately. Caleb looked across the exposed basin. He could see obvious differences between some sections, but not every transition was clean. Some soil changed gradually. Some wet areas overlapped. And one narrow strip near the east side looked sandy enough to concern him, though it covered far less ground than the larger zones he had marked. Caleb should have isolated it. Instead, he looked at the limited material calculation in his notebook. One proven compacted treatment. One equipment window. One grazing opportunity, moving toward a deadline. Roy nodded toward the map. You still confident enough to use equipment day? Yes, Caleb said. We can do it. By the time he began marking the full repair area, Caleb had made a decision that felt efficient enough to be responsible. He would use one uniform treatment rate across the map basin sections. The successful patch had earned him his first real authority. Now the same success was about to test whether he understood its limits. The repair day started before sunrise. Roy had arranged the equipment. Caleb had the basin marked, the bentonite staged, and the notebook opened at a rate he had chosen for every treated section. Roy stopped beside the first marked zone. This your final layout? Yes. All the same rate? Yes. Roy studied him. You sure? Caleb glanced toward the narrow sandy strip on the east side. It was still there. Still different. Still small enough to look like an exception they could absorb inside the larger plan. The compaction matters most, Caleb said. If we keep the application consistent, we can finish the mapped areas today. Roy did not argue. That made the decision Caleb's. They began. Under Roy's control, the equipment opened and worked the exposed sections while Caleb directed placement and checked boundaries. Loose, pale material disappeared into darker soil. Treated areas were blended and compacted. The messy white squares Wes had mocked were gone, replaced by broad, firm sections that looked almost ordinary. Wes stood near the fence for part of the morning. This is a lot of work for mud. Caleb kept walking the flags. Wes added, at least now it's expensive mud. Roy looked over from the equipment. Wes! That was enough. By midday, even Wes had stopped joking. The work was consuming real material, real machine time, real fuel. The kind of commitment that made a failed experiment impossible to dismiss as harmless. Caleb checked his remaining bentonite. The pile was shrinking almost exactly as planned. That reassured him. Every zone was getting the same control treatment. No guesswork. No frantic changes halfway through. They finished late in the day. Caleb walked the compacted sections after the equipment stopped. The surface felt dense beneath his boots. The borders were clean. Material use stayed close to his estimate. For first time in weeks, the repair looked complete. Alice came by the next afternoon. If it stabilizes, we can still make a reduced start date, Roy told her. Alice looked toward Caleb. How long before you trust it? Caleb almost said 7 days. That was what the test patch had needed. But this was not the test patch. This needs to show us what the whole pond does. Alice nodded. I can hold the grazing decision a little longer. For the first few days, the decline appeared slower. Caleb marked the stake each morning. The difference was not dramatic, but it looked encouraging. Roy noticed too. So, better. That mean good. It means better. Caleb was learning not to turn every improvement into a verdict. But inside, he was already calculating grazing days. Then, after several dry afternoons, the water line changed faster. Caleb noticed it first at the stake. The fresh mark sat lower than he expected. He checked the previous entries, measured again, then walked the shoreline. Most treated areas looked stable. Near the east bank, damp ground had retreated sharply around the narrow strip he had almost separated during planning. Caleb knelt and pushed his fingers into the exposed soil. Grainy. Loose. The sandy seam. He stood quickly and followed it along the bank. It was narrower than the larger treatment zones, but it extended farther than he had realized. The uniform application had covered it, just not heavily enough for what that soil required. Roy came down the slope. You find something? Caleb pointed. This section. The one you marked before? Yes. You treated it. At the same rate as everything else. The sentence sounded worse spoken aloud. Wes arrived behind them. So the patch worked, but the pond didn't? Caleb did not answer immediately. That was close enough to the truth to hurt. The small patch had worked because Caleb had matched the treatment to that soil. Then he had taken the success and removed the matching. He had copied the rate instead of the reasoning. The next morning, the stake confirmed the problem. Another larger-than-expected drop. Alice called Roy before noon. She could not keep waiting with cattle needing a dependable summer plan. The earliest grazing period was canceled. Roy ended the call and walked to where Caleb stood beside the pond. We lost the first window. Caleb stared at the exposed mark. The lease was not completely gone, but it was smaller now. The water margin was worse, and much of the approved bentonite had already been used. Roy looked toward the sandy seam. We have less material, less time, and a pond still falling. Caleb opened his map. For the first time, the uniform zones looked less like order and more like the mistake they were. He still had some material. He still had the successful patch. He still had Alice's interest in a smaller grazing arrangement. But one more broad guess would finish what remained of all three. The tanker truck arrived on Roy's list of options before Caleb finished redrawing the pond map. Roy did not present it as punishment. That made it harder to reject. "We can haul water," he said. "Cut the grazing plan again. Keep enough cattle here to justify the pasture and stop betting the summer on this pond." Caleb looked at the figures in his notebook. Tanker water would buy time. It would also turn every grazing day into another delivery cost. The lease income would shrink before Alice's cattle ever entered the pasture. Wes stood beside the fence, unusually quiet. Caleb looked toward the waterline stake. The pond had fallen far enough that the older marks now seemed almost optimistic. How much would we keep? Roy named a reduced number. Caleb did not argue with the herd reduction. That part made sense. He had already lost the original grazing window. What he could not accept was treating tanker water as a permanent answer before understanding the seam he had missed. "Reduce the grazing plan," Caleb said. Roy waited. "But don't schedule the tanker yet." Roy's expression tightened. "You have another repair plan?" "I have a different one." "That's what you said before." Caleb nodded. "I know." He did not defend himself. The uniform rate mistake belonged to him. He had taken one successful test and treated it like a universal formula. The fix could not be another confident guess. Caleb spread the old map across the truck hood and placed his soil jar notes beside it. Instead of drawing broad treatment zones first, he began with places where the waterline behavior and soil texture changed together. The fine section near the original compacted patch became one zone. The mixed bottom became another. The sandy seam became its own narrow strip. Wes leaned closer. "You're making more sections now?" "Yes." "Wouldn't that have helped the first time?" Caleb looked at him. "Yes." Wes had no answer to that. Caleb spent the rest of the day walking the exposed basin. He marked where the soil changed underfoot, compared those places with the retreat patterns he had already recorded, used the waterline history as a guide rather than pretending it could show exactly where every underground seep path ran. By evening, the new map looked less neat than the first one. That was exactly why Caleb trusted it more. The pond bottom was not neat. Roy studied the markings. "You have enough material for this?" "Not if we repeat the first rate everywhere." "So, what are you changing?" "The treatment follows the soil this time." Caleb pointed to the sandy seam. "That section gets more attention. The tighter soils don't need us wasting the same amount there." "And equipment?" "One controlled repair window." Roy shook his head slightly. "You're still trying to finish in one day. I'm trying to finish the important zones in one day." That distinction stopped Roy. Caleb continued. "If we run short, we stop before pretending the whole basin is done." Roy looked at the map again. That was the real change, not just the zones. Caleb was no longer using completion as proof. Roy agreed. The next repair window began with less confidence and more checking. Adults handled the equipment. Caleb stayed on foot, directing the sequence from a map. They worked the tighter soil only where needed. Then the mixed areas. The sandy seam came last because Caleb wanted the remaining bentonite visible before committing it. When they reached it, the difference in the ground was obvious. The soil broke looser. It did not bind like the earlier test patch. Caleb adjusted the treatment for that zone rather than forcing the same formula across it. Wes watched from the edge. No white squares this time. No. What do we call this? Caleb looked at the narrow seam, the part one should have separated before. Wes did not laugh. Roy controlled the compaction passes, while Caleb checked the marked boundaries. The work moved more slowly than the first repair. They stopped more often. Changed placement between zones. At one point, Roy shut the equipment down and climbed off. We're burning daylight. I know. We can cover more if we stop changing the setup. Caleb felt the old temptation immediately. Finish everything. Make the basin look complete. Use one setting and keep moving. He looked at the sandy seam. No. Roy waited. If we cover more ground wrong, we're right back here. Roy climbed back onto the equipment. They continued by zone. By late afternoon, the most suspicious seep areas had been worked and compacted. Some less critical ground remained untouched. Caleb left it that way. The first repair had looked more complete. The second looked more deliberate. That evening, Alice met Roy at the pasture gate. I can still use fewer grazing days, she said, but I need a final answer soon. Roy looked toward Caleb. Caleb did not promise her the pond was fixed. We need the dry spell to test it. How long? Long enough that rain can't hide the result. The forecast was already turning against them. Clear days. Heat. No useful rain expected. Exactly the conditions that could expose another failure. Roy folded the revised map and handed it back. If it drops hard again, we haul water. Caleb nodded. That was fair. This time there would be no third redesign disguised as optimism. They had reduced the grazing plan, used the remaining material where the soil demanded it, left unnecessary ground alone, and accepted that the pond now had to prove itself under conditions nobody could soften. The 14-day dry stretch began the next morning. On the first morning, Caleb marked the waterline and wrote the date beside it. Then he did the same thing the next morning. And the next. No rain came. The pasture browned another shade each afternoon. Dusk gathered along the road. The pond lost some water, as Caleb expected, but the question was whether the drop stayed inside the evaporation range Roy had agreed to before the test began. Caleb refused to move that standard after the fact. On day 4, Wes walked down with him. He looked at the stake. That good. Caleb checked the previous mark. It's inside the band. So good. So far. Wes frowned. Caleb almost smiled. A month earlier, Wes had mocked the stakes themselves. Now he wanted to know what they said. By day 6, the sandy seam remained exposed along part of the bank. But the sharp retreat Caleb had seen after the first basin repair had not returned. He walked it anyway. Pressed the soil. Checked the compacted edges. Looked for new wet lines appearing beyond the treated zone. Nothing gave him permission to celebrate. Roy watched him from uphill. You keep expecting it to fail. Caleb stood. I keep checking whether it did. That different. It is now. The 7th day passed without rain. Then the 8th. Alice came by on the 9th afternoon. Her reduced grazing plan was still possible, but not indefinitely. She stood beside Roy while Caleb checked the stake. How much has it dropped? She asked. Caleb showed her the agreed band marked in his notebook. Still within what we allowed for evaporation. Alice looked at the pond. And the leak? I can't prove there's zero seepage. I can prove it isn't falling the way it was. That was the answer Alice needed more than a claim of perfection. She nodded. I'll hold a reduced plan through the end of your test. The next 5 days became harder precisely because nothing dramatic happened. No storm interrupted the test. No sudden collapse exposed a hidden mistake. No miraculous rise rewarded Caleb. The sun kept pulling water from the surface. The stake kept recording small losses. Each morning, Caleb had to decide whether those losses were ordinary or the beginning of another failure. On day 11, one reading sat closer to the edge of the agreed band than he liked. He measured again. Same result. Wes saw his face. What? Closer today. Outside. No. Then why do you look like that? Because tomorrow matters. That evening, wind crossed the pond for hours. Caleb knew that could increase evaporation. He also knew how badly he wanted the next mark to stay safe. He did not touch the stake, did not adjust the band, did not reinterpret the agreement. The test only meant something if the rule survived his anxiety. At sunrise on day 12, Roy was already waiting. Caleb took the reading. Still inside. By day 13, the decline slowed again. Caleb walked the repaired bank. The compacted zones remained intact. The sandy seam was no longer behaving like a drain that pulled the shoreline backward faster than the rest of the pond. Roy joined him near the original test area. You think you know now? One more day. Roy looked toward the stake. You always as stubborn? Caleb glanced at him. I was more stubborn before. Roy almost laughed. The 14th day arrived hot and cloudless. Alice came shortly after sunrise. Wes followed Roy down the bank without being asked. No one stood near the old white test squares anymore. Those were mostly gone. The stake was what mattered now. Caleb carried the notebook to the water's edge. The oldest marks showed how badly the pond had been falling before the repair. The newer marks told a different story. He crouched and took the final reading, then checked it again. Roy waited. Alice said nothing. Wes leaned forward. Caleb stood. Inside the band, Roy held out his hand. Caleb gave him the notebook. Roy compared the 14 days of marks with the agreed limits. He looked at the pond, then at the east bank, then back at Caleb. No tanker. Not for the reduced plan. Roy handed the notebook back. No tanker. The words carried more weight than Caleb expected. Alice nodded toward the pasture. Then I'll bring the smaller group we discussed. Roy agreed. The grazing arrangement was not restored to what they had first imagined. Caleb had already lost that. The early window was gone. The stocking level was reduced. Those consequences stayed. But the pond had passed the test that mattered. 14 rainless days. No sharp collapse. No hidden rescue from a storm. No tank or water masking the result. Wes walked to the stake and looked at the markings himself. Show me which line was the limit. Caleb pointed it out. Wes traced the marks with his eyes. So, this is what you've been reading every morning? Yes. Wes looked across the pond. The mud didn't do that by itself. No. Roy pointed toward the folded seep zone map in Caleb's notebook. Keep that current. It was not yet the pasture authority Caleb had once demanded. It was something better. A responsibility tied to proof. The pond had given Roy his answer. Now the remaining question was whether that answer would last long enough to make the smaller, grazing least pay for what Caleb had spent fixing it. Alice brought the reduced group into the pasture 3 days later. Caleb stood with Roy near the gate while the cattle moved onto the grass in a slow line. No one treated the moment like a victory. The grazing plan was smaller than the one Alice had first proposed. The start was later. The early income Caleb had imagined after the 7-day patch was gone. But the tanker truck never came. That was the difference. Each morning, Caleb still checked the pond. Not because Roy ordered him to, because the repair had taught him what one successful test could not. A pond could appear stable and still contain a weak zone. A method could work and still fail when applied too broadly. A good result did not remove the need to keep measuring. For the first week of grazing, Caleb watched three things: the marked waterline, the compacted sandy seam, the pressure the reduced livestock group placed on the pond. The waterline continued moving slowly with heat and evaporation. It did not return to the sharp weekly decline that had started the entire problem. Alice noticed. She stopped beside Caleb one afternoon while he checked the stake. "How much tanker water have you hauled?" "None." She looked toward Roy, repairing a fence farther uphill. "That probably makes him happy." Caleb smiled slightly. "It makes the numbers better." Alice laughed. "That too." The grazing days accumulated. That was the proof Caleb had not been able to produce during the 14-day test. The dry spell had shown that the redesigned sealing zones could hold the pond inside the agreed band. But a test was still a test. Now the pond had a function, while livestock actually depended on it. Caleb kept the stocking level where Roy and Alice had agreed. He did not push for more animals just because the water appeared stable. That surprised Wes. One morning, Wes met him at the stake. "You could probably handle more cattle now." Caleb looked across the pond. "Probably isn't the agreement." Wes glanced at him. "A month ago, you would have tried." "A month ago, I put one rate across every soil because one patch worked." Wes nodded slowly. Then he pointed at the water line. "Where was yesterday?" Caleb showed him. Wes crouched and compared the marks himself. That became a habit. He stopped calling the bentonite patches mud. He stopped asking whether Caleb had finally fixed the pond. Instead, he asked where the line had been, whether the sandy seam had changed, whether Caleb had updated the map after a new section of bank became exposed. The change was quiet enough that Caleb almost missed it. Wes had gone from mocking the measurements to using them. By the end of the reduced grazing period, Alice met Roy at the house to settle the lease payment. Caleb was outside when Roy called him in. An envelope sat on the table beside Caleb's notebook. Roy tapped it. Alice paid. Caleb nodded. He had known she would have the grazing arrangement completed as agreed. What he did not know was what the final numbers looked like. Roy opened Caleb's repair notes. They had tracked the approved bentonite, the wasted material from the failed surface test, the main repair, and the smaller amount used in the zone redesign. The lease didn't make what the first plan would have made, Roy said. "I know." "We lost days." "I know." "We reduced the stocking." Caleb nodded. Roy looked at him, but it covered the repair material. Caleb stared at the figures. Not the equipment time. Not every cost connected to the failed first expansion, but the material itself. The clay Wes had called wasted mud. The second repair Caleb had nearly lost the right to attempt. The soil-specific redesign that had forced them to accept a smaller grazing plan, instead of pretending they could recover the original one. Alice's payment covered it. Caleb let out a breath. Roy closed the notebook. "You wanted pasture management." Caleb looked up. "Yes." "You're not getting it." A few months earlier, that sentence would have felt like another rejection. Now Caleb waited. Roy continued. "You are taking over the pond inspections." Caleb said nothing. "Supervised maintenance planning, waterline records, soil zone map. You see a change. You bring it to me before anyone moves equipment or livestock. That's my responsibility?" "That's your responsibility." Roy pointed at him. "Supervised." "I heard you. And you don't turn one good result into a rule for the whole pond." Caleb smiled. "I heard that too." Roy handed him the seep zone map. It was wrinkled now, marked with corrections. The first broad treatment lines were still visible beneath Caleb's later notes. He had considered redrawing it clean. Now, he was glad he had not. The mistakes belonged on the map, too. Later that week, Roy unfolded the pasture planning sheet across the same kitchen table. Beside grazing rotations and fence notes, he added Caleb's pond map, not as an experiment, as part of the plan. Caleb stood at the pond that evening while the reduced group grazed beyond the fence. Wes was already there. He leaned over the stake. Still inside? Caleb checked the newest mark. Yes. Wes nodded as though that was the most ordinary thing in the world. The pasture around them was dry. The summer had not become easier. The pond was not magically full. It still lost water to heat. It still needed watching. But the marked stake stood in water that had stopped racing downward. The sandy seam no longer dictated the fate of the entire basin. And the white test squares everyone had called mud had led to something Caleb wanted more than being proven right. Roy trusted him with something that mattered. Caleb looked across the pond, then down at the map in his hand. This time, he did not see one solution. He saw zones, limits, evidence, and responsibility.